Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy that you can join us today. We welcome to our fourth online training session of the year. And today we will be focusing on a very important, complex one, but important issue for us. We will speak about the LEAP and TNFD approaches. So it's very important, and thank you for joining us today. Christine, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Guillen. Also from my side, it's really nice to meet you today. Welcome. My name is Christine. I'm a program manager at Frankfurt School, and together with my colleagues, we work on biodiversity, sustainable finance topics. You met Jonas Flair, I think, in the last online session. Those of you who already joined this. And I'm very happy that we have this important topic today. And a great lecturer who also worked in the past already with us on biodiversity topics. Johan, thank you very much for being here today. He's a lead expert in nature capital, also biodiversity. And Johan, I will hand over to you now, and thank you very much, everyone, for joining today.
Hey, thank you, Christine and Guillen, for these introductions. Welcome, everyone. My name is Johan Lammerand. I work for Arcadis, and I'm the Global Technical Director, Nature and Biodiversity for Arcadis. Arcadis is a multinational design and engineering and consultancy company with more than 30,000 people globally, with headquarters in the Netherlands, Amsterdam. I'm based in Belgium, and we have established over the past years, we have established a business and biodiversity team. So really focusing on how the private sector can deal with biodiversity. And since a few years now, we are also working together with Frankfurt Business School in developing suitable training materials for people from financial institutions that want to know more about how they can integrate nature and biodiversity into their daily operations, let's say. So I was asked to provide a specific webinar on the TNFD and the TNFD LEAP approach. So we'll come to that. As has been said, it's might look like a bit of a complex thing, but I will go through it step by step, and I will try to make everything as clear as possible. We start with an overall introduction on how to do a biodiversity assessment in a context of financial decisions, financial institutions. And then after we have gone through the theory and not only the theory, of course, but also the practical applications of TNFD and its LEAP approach, we will discuss a number of common tools, and we will end with a reference to the TNFD website, where you can see many frequently asked questions, and also how you can find example cases on how financial institutions can apply the TNFD. So you can always because it's in 90 minutes webinar. I don't like to be talking on myself all the time, so please interrupt me. If you have a question on the screen, I don't see if you are raising your hand, but I think, Kristen, you can help me in interrupting me as soon as one of the participants has a question.
Yes, of course.
Yeah. So please, let's make it a bit interactive where possible. If you have questions, raise your hands. So the objective of today is that. I will clarify how, as a financial institution, you can do a scoping of your activities that are really relevant in the context of nature-related risks and so on, because as a financial institution, You have many types of services and activities. My understanding is that you are mainly representing development banks. So the focus today will be mainly on concrete project financing, because that's, I think, one of the most relevant activities of development banks, especially when it comes to understanding nature-related risks. Then we also discuss how to measure impacts and dependencies, how to link these to risks and opportunities, how to do a materiality assessment, and at the end, very briefly on setting nature-related targets and taking action. We will also talk about disclosures based on the TNFD metrics, what is recommended and what is purely voluntary. Okay, and also we will discuss a number of tools today. So overall introduction on biodiversity assessment. In fact, what we see in the different available frameworks, and you see here at the bottom, we have TNFD. The blue line at the bottom refers to CSRD, so the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive of the EU. And we also have SBTN. SBTN is not a reporting framework, it's a target setting framework. But at the end, all these initiatives or frameworks, or we can call them, they all rely on the same building blocks on how to come from identifying your really material issues to reporting and to take actions, to set targets, to take actions. It starts always with the scoping phase, where to focus. So for financial institutions, it's about the financial products and the related sectors. Very important. Maybe groups of companies within these sectors, and in some cases also commodities where you are investing in can be important, because you have the so-called high impact commodities defined by SBTN. It's a list of typical commodities which are known to have adverse impacts on biodiversity. For instance, palm oil, but also timber and so on. In the scoping phase, it's also important to identify the areas, the locations with the critical nature interfacing, because, and we will come to that, because not every place is critical in terms of biodiversity. So it's really important to try to be as specific as possible in terms of the location. Then materiality is a second big step. So identification of the key nature-related impacts and dependencies. What are the impact drivers that are driving these impacts? We refer to the IPBES impact drivers, but there might be others. The concept of double materiality assessments, and then also materiality is also about prioritization of locations based on the significance of your impacts and so on. Then risks and opportunities. Why does it matter? Because at the end, it's not sufficient to identify your impacts and dependencies, but it's much more interesting to know what are the related risks related to these impacts and the dependencies. And also, would you have opportunities that reduce risks, but also opportunities to make new profitable business or to invest in nature restoration, as long as there is also a business case for doing so. And then finally, the actions. So this is the overall framework, the overall common building blocks. I talked about location. As you know, contrary to greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity is very location specific. Biodiversity is different from place to place, because you have many species, many specific habitats, and these are all spread all over the world, but in many different ways. So it also means that you need to go to the location-specific context, location-specific state of nature to really understand what is the value of biodiversity, what is the importance of biodiversity, the sensitiveness of biodiversity, and so on, to drivers, to pressures, drivers of impacts. So this is the way to go. You identify the drivers of impact of your projects where you are investing in as a bank, and you are usually doing an EIA, an environmental impact assessment, as a development bank. So you know the drivers of impact. There you have the 5 drivers identified by IPBES, but there are other drivers, for instance, disturbance, light disturbance, noise disturbance, human presence. These can, in some cases, also be very relevant. And then you combine it with the location-specific state of nature. And TNFD, but also CSRD, have identified some characteristics for what are now the really sensitive locations in terms of biodiversity or in terms of nature in general. It's, of course, areas of high biodiversity value. They also sometimes are called high integrity ecosystems, or areas of rapid decline, where threats on nature are very prominent. Areas of water stress are also included, because areas of water stress are also much more vulnerable or sensitive to biodiversity decline. And combining these two, the drivers and the location-specific characteristics, leads us to the ranking of locations. And based on that, you can identify the priority locations and also priority supply chains, because you can also apply it to broader supply chains. Okay, you start, of course, taking action on your priority locations. What about impacts and dependencies on nature for financial institutions? Usually for businesses, businesses usually start with looking to their direct operations. So their manufacturing sites, their logistics sites, and so on. Because these sites in traditional industry have already, or they generate already many impact drivers on nature. There are air emissions, there is wastewater, there is solid waste, there is also noise, and so on. So yeah, direct operations should be in the scope, but for financial institutions, what are your direct operations? It's your offices. So the impacts and dependencies for financial institutions related to direct operations are very limited. You only have a bit of greenhouse gas emissions because you are heating the building. But these are covered in your climate strategies. Of course, you use a little bit of water, but this is all, let's say, quite peanuts compared to the real impact. And the real impact for financial institutions is, of course, your portfolios. Downstream. For you, it's downstream, because upstream for you is where you buy your electricity, your paper, your coffee, and so on. So also upstream is for a financial institution very limited. So contrary to most other private organizations, where downstream is a little bit out of scope, let's be honest, they are mainly focusing on direct operations and upstream. Downstream is the part of the value chain that really matters for financial institutions. It's your portfolios related to your financial activities. Okay, after this introduction on some general principles related to biodiversity assessment for financial institutions, let's dive into the TNFD approach. I must say the TNFD has an excellent website, so you can find plenty of useful reports which are updated all the time to keep them very actual. And please have a look. The main document is the TNFD recommendations. This is not presented here on this slide, but the TNFD recommendations are about all the different articles of the TNFD framework, and how you need to deal with that, how you need to report, and so on. It also includes the metrics, the core metrics, and so on. But then you have plenty of sector guidance. You have also a specific sector guidance document for financial institutions. We talked already about the LEAP approach, which is a very specific tool developed within the TNFD approach to go from impact dependencies to risks and opportunities. They also have specific guidance on that, and yeah, they have much more. So I really recommend to take a look. So they came up with their disclosure recommendations a few years ago. It was in September 2023, only 2 years ago, to assess, report, and act on nature-related dependencies, impacts, and risks and opportunities. This is also called DIRO, dependencies, impacts, risks, opportunities. So you might have seen this acronym DIRO from time to time. The aim of the TNFD, which is a fully voluntary approach, so it's not mandatory. It's important to be aware, contrary to the CSRD, which is a European directive, and there many companies have to report according to CSRD. But TNFD is completely voluntary. And the aim is to support a shift in global finance flows towards nature-positive outcomes. You see on this diagram, but also this diagram is updated all the time, there are already more than 500 adopters, TNFD adopters globally. You see there also the regional spread. So you see mainly in Europe and Asia. You see already, and I think this is very interesting, in this picture already 129 financial institutions are working with TNFD, which is quite amazing after 2 years since the launch of TNFD. Now TNFD is also very much focused also on finance, because they already had this TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And so it's their natural target public, I would say. But of course, it's also open to corporates. This is the overall construction of the TNFD. So you have 4 pillars: governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and then metrics and targets, with a number of disclosures, groups of disclosures. There are 14 recommended disclosures. There were 11 in TCFD on climate. But TNFD has added a few specific disclosures, and the first one is on indigenous peoples and local communities. We have seen over the past years that the emphasis on social acceptance of your activities, especially in remote areas, has become very important. So the concept of indigenous peoples, local communities, IPLC, as another acronym, has become very prominent in all recent policies and so on. So also in TNFD, they have a specific section on that, meaning under governance, that you also should describe in your policy and strategies how you take into account impacts on local communities, which might be affected by nature-related impacts and dependencies and risks and opportunities. So due to the activities of the companies in your portfolio or the projects that you are investing in, they might have, of course, social impacts, and you need to describe how you deal with that in your policies. Of course, contrary, as I said it already, contrary to the CFD, which is about climate and greenhouse gas emissions, there is now a specific disclosure on location. That's the second one marked here. You need to be very specific about the priority locations that you take into account. And then there is another one, which is about the processes for identifying this DIRO, dependencies, impacts, risks and opportunities, both in your direct operations and in the full value chain. This disclosure framework is a result of Target 15 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, which was agreed in Montreal in 2023, a few years ago, or was it already 22? I don't know. Which has a specific target on transparency and corporate reporting on nature-related risks, dependencies, and impacts. As I said, there is TNFD always has a very important sector focus. They have their general recommendations, but then they have their sector-specific guidance. Now, for the finance community, they have also specified how these 4 pillars translate into specific, let's say, points that you need to take into consideration as a financial institution. So for governments, in fact, I mentioned it already, it's very much related to these indigenous peoples and local communities, affected stakeholders in general. You need to describe how you work with your investee companies and counterparties to ensure that you take into account all these social elements. In terms of strategy, you need to describe the sectors, and this is very important for you as a financial institution, the sectors where you are investing in. The biomes, the realms, these are maybe terms that might be new again for you, but realm, it's also defined in TNFD. A realm is oceans, air, freshwater, the land. These are the realms. And biomes there are 25 biomes which are specified in TNFD. Biomes are ecosystems, groups of ecosystems like mountain grasslands or tropical forests, marshland and wetlands. These are biomes. And in your strategy, you need to take all these elements into account. You need to provide information on how risks and opportunities are embedded in the services you are offering to clients. You need to describe how you do scenario analysis. You do this for climate, but you should also do that for nature and biodiversity, meaning that you should think about scenarios of further ongoing ecosystem degradation and how this will affect the risks that you have identified. For risk and impact management, I already said that the focus for financial institutions is on downstream. And with regards to metrics and targets, I will come to that. Always report at appropriate levels. You have also some freedom. There are a number of mandatory metrics that you need to follow. We come to that, but you also have the freedom to come up with additional relevant metrics to really demonstrate your performance in the best possible way. And then we come to this famous LEAP approach. LEAP is an acronym for locate, evaluate, assess, and prepare. And this is let's say, a step-by-step approach that facilitates the identification of the DIRO. I use this term a few times: dependencies, impacts, risks, opportunities. The locate phase is very much about your interface with nature. So, meaning, what activities will you take into your scope? It starts with a scoping exercise, maybe which geographies, because you can always apply TNFD in a gradual way. You can start from somewhere, and then over the years you can expand to your full range of activities. Maybe so. Start small maybe. Okay, we'll see later on in this presentation how you can use some tools to help you understand where you have the main interfaces with nature. And then there's the evaluation phase, which is really about this impacts and dependencies and the materiality assessment. What are now really important, significant impacts and dependencies? How is this translating into risks and opportunities? Also here, double materiality, risks for society, but also risks for you as a business. The double materiality perspective is very important. And in terms of risks, we have this classification of physical risks, a risk related to, for instance, disruption of operations of the companies in your portfolio due to all kinds of natural hazards, which might get worse due to ecosystem degradation, and on top of that, climate change. So we see this already happening. There are wildfires everywhere. There is droughts, and all of these phenomena have consequences for a business operation, and in this way also for you as a financial institution. So also this, and here you apply scenario analysis. You need to assess the real materiality of risks and opportunities. And then prepare is about target setting, strategy building, disclosure. Okay. I pause here a little bit, maybe just to ask if there are questions, to give you the opportunity to ask questions. I don't know.
So far, there are no hands up, but okay. Yeah, I also, if you have questions, you can also always post in the chat if you don't want to use the microphone.
Okay, good. All right, let's go on. Well, it all starts with a good scoping. What is a scoping? It's a quick, high-level preliminary scan of existing internal and external data and reference sources that allows you to generate a hypothesis about the organization's potential nature-related dependencies, impacts, risks, and opportunities, because that will make it easier to identify or to define the boundaries of your LEAP assessments, and also to ensure managers and the assessment team that everything is aligned in terms of goals and timelines. So the working hypothesis is based on what is the scope of your activities that you will take into account. For instance, for development banks, of course, I think the obvious one is your portfolio of assets where you are investing in. Yeah, and you can classify this further in terms of sectors, maybe energy-related projects, extraction-related projects, agriculture projects, and so on. You can also further refine in terms of geographies. Aligning on goals and resourcing is just a logical way of doing projects. You need to be clear about the time horizon. You need to be clear about, do we have the required knowledge, capacities, what will be the costs for doing such an exercise, and so on. And also you should think about your approach to materiality. But we'll come to that. So the desired outputs for applying the TNFD LEAP approach, again, for the 4 phases, locate. You should have a clear overview of where your operations, where your activities, mean your investments, where they overlap with important biodiversity, based on the tools that we will discuss later on. For the second step, evaluate, you will have a list of the environmental assets and maybe ecosystem services which are related to that at each priority location, with a clear overview of nature-related dependencies, impacts, and also about maybe the size and the scale of these dependencies and nature impacts, because it can be that based on your whole assessment that you identify, for instance, that water scarcity is one of the most common issues throughout your portfolio. And of course, this creates specific, which is a very important dependency at the end for your activities. Water supply, water provisioning, the availability of fresh water for the activities of the projects you are investing in is, of course, a very important dependency. If many of them are located in water scarcity areas, then it might become a risk. That's then the next pillar of LEAP, the assess phase. You will generate a long list of relevant nature-related risks where the organization should act on. But you can also think already in terms of opportunities. Again, TNFD has developed in its sector guidance already very inspirational tables with sector-related risks and opportunities, which are linked to the typical impacts and dependencies of the sector in terms of nature. Okay, but let's go to the next slides. Here we come to the metrics, so the disclosure. What is in focus for TNFD? Well, the direct operations, but of course, as has been said, downstream, very important. So your financial portfolios. In the financial guidance, so the additional guidance for financial institutions, and I have added the link here, you find a few tables. This here with the core metrics that you should disclose. So core metrics have a C, and then you can also have additional metrics which have an A. So they are numbered, and the core metrics, which are which means that core metrics need to be reported anyway, or if they are not reported, you should explain it. So it's on a comply or explain basis, these core metrics. And you see what the core metrics are. The core metrics that are presented here are not specifically for financial institutions. They come from the TNFD recommendations, which apply to the whole private sector, or to, let's say, to all organizations that want to disclose. But here, the second table is then specifically for the finance community, and you see here that on C7 to C7.4, the risks and opportunities, that for direct operations, this is not really relevant. So it is expected to be the exception that you should report for your direct operations only if material. Yeah, so sorry, I forgot to go into the details of this first table. The risk metrics are really about the value of assets and liabilities and revenues and so on that are assessed as vulnerable to nature-related physical risks or nature-related transition risks. So physical risks, I mentioned it already, it's related to operational disruptions due to all kinds of natural hazards. Transition risks can be reputational risks, can be compliance risks. Do you still comply to legislation? Can be market risks. For instance, in a competitive market, you can get behind if you don't invest in time and so on. So energy transition is an example. The transition to more regenerative farming is another example. So, and this all creates specific risks. And another transition risk is called financial, finance related, and this is more from the perspective of businesses. Businesses are now also seeing that financial institutions are imposing more specific conditions for their loans and their loans policy. So it means that a company, an industrial company, that is not taking action on reducing pollution and so on, that it might be more difficult for the company to be financed by a financial institution. So that's a transition risk for the company. So that's this classification of physical risks, transition risks. It also comes back in CSRD. So this is now terminology which is becoming quite mainstream. And this is something that these are core risks metrics. Core opportunity metrics are then the amount of capital that are deployed towards nature-related opportunities. It can be, in some cases, it can be, for instance, investing in the restoration or conservation of a nature area. It can be done. So this will happen more and more due to the fact that you have policies at international level to create more nature, to restore more nature. And private finance will also become very important to get this, to achieve these goals, because with finance from public authorities alone, we will not achieve these goals. So private finance will come in, and this is then considered as opportunities. So, and here you see in the second table that, for instance, for financial portfolios, what is really important are here the core financial sector metrics, exposure to sectors and exposure to sensitive locations. So that's important for you to know. This is not applicable, of course, to your direct operations, but it's very much applicable to your portfolio. So within your portfolio, you need to identify, you need to assess which are the sectors with high impacts, high dependencies on nature. Same for locations. What are the locations that, what is your exposure to sensitive locations due to your investment activities? This is something that you will need to disclose anyway, because it's obligatory within TNFD. I mean, TNFD is a voluntary framework, but if you apply it, you need to apply these indicators. And then there are a number of additional metrics that you can use. So here is a little bit of repetition for these two important core metrics. So a metric that represents the exposure to a defined set of sectors considered to have material nature-related dependencies and impacts. And you see for the different types of financial sectors what it means. And secondly, you need to have a metric that represents the exposure to companies with assets and or activities in sensitive locations. For development banks, you can immediately focus on your own projects that you are financing. You don't have to go through the company portfolio that you are investing in. Voila, and there at the bottom you see once again the range of, or let's say the different types of sensitive locations according to the TNFD definition.
There is a question in the chat.
Okay, before we start with the tools, then we can take indeed a question. Yes, what is the question?
Perfect. From Kidis Desta, he asks, there seems to be an overlap between TNFD additions and the IFC performance standard 6 and 7. Just an observation. If you have any insights, it would be good to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, the IFC performance standards, so these are not disclosure metrics, but they are of course very much focusing on specific projects. They are also much more demanding than what is now here recommended within TNFD, because the IFC PS6 performance standards, they really go into the details. You need to identify critical habitats. If you have critical habitats, you need to apply no net loss and so on. So you also need to identify which are the threatened species, and so you really need to go. You need to apply an environmental and social impact assessments to be compliant with with the International Finance Corporation performance standards. But the principle is the same. In fact, you could say this location focus is always very important for biodiversity. I don't know if this is a sufficient answer. Okay. If no other questions at this moment, we can immediately jump to the tools. Yeah. So starting with the locate phase, but this interferes a little bit with the next phase of the evaluate phase. But a really good tool that you all should be aware of is Anchor. I'm sure that many of you might have applied even Anchor. Anchor is a tool that has been developed, in fact, in first instance for the financial community. It gives an overview of the sector-related specific dependencies and impacts on nature. It's high level because it provides a sector generic overview. So it's not company specific, it's not location specific, and it's definitely not location specific, but because it does not include spatial information, it's also difficult for such a high level tool to include spatial information. But it allows you to, when you start doing this whole assessment, it helps you with the scoping. You can, when you analyze your portfolio, and you have, for instance, a large amount of energy-related projects or companies, Anchor gives you immediately the insight in the main dependencies and impacts on nature for that particular sector. It's even now in the latest update of Anchor, it distinguishes between wind energy, solar energy, hydropower, and so on, which was not the case in the original version. And they also have this impact categories now. So this is Anchor. IBAT is the International Biodiversity Assessment Tool. Anchor, by the way, is free of charge. It's an open source data platform. IBAT is behind a paywall. It's managed by a number of international NGOs on nature conservation, like BirdLife International is very prominent here, and they argue that the fact that they need to maintain this whole website, IBAT, sorry, forgot to mention, IBAT gives you an insight in protected areas globally. So with this location details, so you know for every place on Earth in a very granular way, so it's really very exact. It shows you where protected areas are located and what type of protected areas, key biodiversity areas, Natura 2000 areas in Europe, or they have several categories, but it's all covered. So it allows you, as soon as you know geospatial information of your project, or maybe the assets of the companies in your portfolio, you immediately, it allows you to do the interface with nature immediately. And then before I start the discussion on this, I want to also say, I will also want to refer to the WWF Biodiversity Risk Filter and the WWF Water Risk Filter. These are also free of charge. It's also open source. These provide maps, less granular. This is then, of course, maybe in some cases a disadvantage, but it gives you already at a larger scale a good overview of sensitive locations and also a whole range of related risks. So it provides you also with indicators, a number of risk indicators, for instance, water scarcity indicator and so on. which has its particular advantages, let's say. I wanted to mention related to IBAT and also the biodiversity risk filter, because biodiversity risk filter also has a map with protected areas. So it gives you a first indication of your potential impact on nature. It's not, I want to emphasize this, it's not because you have locations or projects nearby or in the proximity of a protected area, or maybe even within a protected area, that there is automatically damage to biodiversity. It all depends on the characteristics of your project. And therefore, in a second phase of your investigation, you should try to do that exercise. What are the impact drivers generated by the project? And can these impact drivers really have an impact on the biodiversity values in that protected area? This is something that you only can do in a second stage of this exploration, not in the first stage. First stage gives you only the indication of proximity to protected areas. That's already something. And it's covered in metrics in many disclosure frameworks. It's covered in the TNFD, in CSRD, also in GRI and the Global Reporting Initiative. This proximity to protected areas is a really very popular metric. But be careful with interpretation. That's what I want to say. In the evaluate phase, which goes deeper, you can use Anchor again, because you have this identification of dependencies and impacts. But you can also use an additional tool. And what we often do as Arcadis, we often use the Global Biodiversity Score, the GBS. The GBS is a tool developed by CDC Biodiversity in France. It's also, you have to pay for it. You need to be accredited to be able to use the tool. But okay, it gives you an insight in what are the main pressures on biodiversity in the value chain of a company. Is it at the level of direct operations, or is it rather in the supply chain? And also the contribution of each of these impact drivers. Is it mainly greenhouse gas emissions maybe? Is that the main driver to biodiversity loss, or is it maybe water consumption? So I will come back to GBS. GBS also has its advantages, because when you apply GBS at portfolios, you can easily see where in the value chains of these companies are the most important impact drivers. That might look already a bit too detailed at this moment, but I will come back to that. On materiality, because you see here E4, impact materiality assessment. Materiality is often done by combining the severity of an impact, and severity is then often a combination of frequency, scale, and so on, and also taking into account the sensitivity of local biodiversity. And this combined with likelihood. What is the likelihood that the impact will occur? So this severity combined with likelihood is typically used in materiality assessments, also in climate-related materiality risk assessment. But every company and every financial institution has its own risk management framework where these materiality approaches are specified. But the challenge now is integrating nature into these existing risk management frameworks. So now a little bit more detail about each of the tools. Anchor, I mentioned already, it's about impacts, it's about dependencies. based on sector level averages, very important, based on an international classification of sectors. ANCOR provides scores from very high to very low for each of these impacts, dependencies that are identified. Based here, you see, on frequency, severity, and dependencies has another scoring system. It's based on the significance of the loss of the functionality in the production process. For instance, a typical dependency, I mentioned it already, is water supply. What will happen if there is insufficient water? If water is not available in sufficient amounts anymore, what will that mean for the production process of the company? And so the score is based on that specifically. So it's also very much sector dependent. And then the significance also of the related financial loss. So operational disruptions and related financial loss. So it's a useful initial screening tool, I mentioned it already, which should be followed by spatially explicit and company-specific assessments. It's sector-based, but of course, it doesn't mean that every company within that sector has the same impacts and dependencies, because it's always a little bit different. This is how such sheets look like in ANCOR. Then IBAT. So IBAT covers global biodiversity data sets. It also includes the IUCN Red List of threatened species. And as I said, also the World Database on Protected Areas and Key Biodiversity Areas. It includes a specific metrics, the STAR metrics. It was developed by IUCN. It's very much based on the presence of threatened species and how these species are affected by different types of pressures. And you can, with IBAT, you need to pay for IBAT, and you also need to pay for different reports that you want to get from IBAT. And one of these reports is related to STAR. But if you pay for it, then the idea is that you can see, okay, here in the neighborhood of my project, there is a high opportunity for restoration measures, because if I take restoration measures, that will translate immediately in a better status for the threatened species. So it works a little bit in that way. We, based on our experience with IBAT, we think that these lists of threatened species are not so practical, because if you have a certain location and you ask for the list of threatened species within, for instance, 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers around the site, very often you get a long list of protected species. And then, okay, what to do with it? So it's, it's not so easy. It's much more pragmatic to start with the protected areas, your proximity to protected areas. And you see, for instance, here in this table, how it looks like. You have the different sites and the surface of each of these sites. And then the number of protected areas and the number of key biodiversity areas in that landscape. The biodiversity risk filter from WWF. It allows you to screen risks and prioritize risks. Very much based on geospatial information. It's also very user-friendly, because when you have a list with all the GIS coordinates of your assets, you can immediately provide these input data into the tool, and you have specific information for all your sites. So it seems to work quite well. As I hear from my colleagues, I haven't used it myself, but it presents really useful information, especially for a risk assessment. And it includes a number of risk indicators, for instance, on erosion risk, flood risk, water scarcity, and so on. And it's based on scores, and it was in one of the slides in an exercise that we originally included in the slide deck, but it's now not included anymore. But we usually take a score if it's higher than 3.4 on a scale of 5, then we consider it as a material risk, and then we rank all the sites based on the number of indicators with a high score, so scores above 3.4, and that allows you to come up with a ranking of your sites. And because many companies have many sites globally, and that definitely applies to development banks, you have many projects worldwide, you can score these projects in terms of potential risks. And then the Global Biodiversity Score, quickly, it's a corporate biodiversity footprint assessment tool. It's a completely different approach. So it's model-based. It's, let's see if I have, yeah, no. So it's based on the sector characteristics. So you classify your project or your company in a certain sector. The Global Biodiversity Score knows the typical pressures related to that sector. It also combines your company activities with value chain activities. So it's based on Axiobase. Axiobase is an environmental input-output model that connects all kinds of economic activities with each other and generates the typical pressures related to all these activities. So in this way, it covers not only direct operations, but also the whole value chain connected to a certain economic activity or a certain economic facility. And then there is a second module within the Global Biodiversity Score. It's called Globio, and Globio translates these pressures to biodiversity footprint figures. And these footprint figures are presented by means of mean species abundance square kilometer. And mean species abundance square kilometer gives an indication of the condition of biodiversity at your location. But it's a corporate footprint tool, so in fact it gives you an idea about the total footprint that you have due to your economic activities as a company. So it's much more suitable for company level assessment and portfolio level assessment, not so much for project level assessment. That's a little bit more complicated. Okay, I think I mentioned this already. So the only thing that you need to do, you need to provide a turnover per type of activity and per geographic region, and the company's expenditures, investments by industry and geography, representing the value chain. Yeah. And what it gives you, for instance, for a company or for a portfolio, it gives you the pressures that are included in the Global Biodiversity Score, and for the different Scope 1, Scope 2, and then Scope 3, but only Scope 3 upstream. Scope 3 downstream is not included in the tool. It gives you the spread of the footprint over the value chain, and also the spread over the different pressures. For instance, in this case, you see that climate change is the almost only impact driver to biodiversity for that specific company. And you see that the main impact is in Scope 1 and Scope 2, and also in the rest of upstream Scope 3. You see, so that for Scope 3, there is a difference between Tier 1 and the other parts of the upstream, but you see that In tier 1, it's a little bit less, only 1 to 5% of total impact, while for the other parts it's more. You see also that in the rest of upstream, that land use comes in, which is normal, very much in your supply chains. You will see that land use is a very dominant impact driver to biodiversity. And this is the way that it is presented. I will not go into the details. GBS also distinguishes between dynamic impacts, representing changes within a fixed period of time, for instance, 1 reporting year, and static impacts. So, in fact, the cumulative, long-lasting impacts that are building up over the years. And it also makes a difference between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. Aquatic, only freshwater, not marine. So oceans is not included in the GBS. This is a table, an example that we did for a commercial bank in Belgium. It gives an overview of the sectors that for the different parts of the value chain that are surpassing the materiality threshold of 5% of the total footprint. So you see, and here you see what I refer to, the dynamic terrestrial footprint, static terrestrial footprint, static aquatic footprint. Okay, this is now distinguished, but you don't have to do that. But you see, for instance, here in tier 1 of the supply chain, that mining and quarrying is the most important sector. It's almost 100% contributing to the dynamic terrestrial footprint. While here, for the static terrestrial footprint, it's mining and quarrying mainly, but also electricity, gas, steam, and air conditioning comes also into play. In the rest of the upstream, you see a more equal distribution of sectors which are contributing to the total biodiversity footprint of that particular bank. So this is a bit how GBS works. It gives you, let's say, an additional layer of information, but it's not that suitable for development banks.
Johan, before we continue, Julie Clark wrote in the chat that she can add to that. So maybe, Julie, if you have any experience with the tools, you can share with us now. Julie? Yeah, hi.
Hi, sorry. Yes, just when you were talking on the WWF water and biodiversity risk tool filter, I just wanted to say I could add to that because you haven't used it, and DBSA did use it. That's the Development Bank of Southern Africa. And it was a very simple and easy tool to plug in our whole loan book. And then you press a button and it pops out all of this information, and you just have to put in the geolocation points of obviously all your investments. But the thing why I liked it so much was because it very quickly, with very few resources, you can come to some general conclusion about where your bank's footprints are and where the double materiality lies, and that's really fantastic to show management on a map.
Yeah.
And the one point I wanted to make in this thing was when you were saying at the beginning in terms of biodiversity, where should your banks invest? We actually invested in the Southern African Biodiversity Institute, or the South African Biodiversity Institute, SANBI. We gave them money to do maps. The maps then fed into WWF's water risk filter, and then we benefited when we had to now save time, costs, and money in assessing our loan book in terms of TNFD. So it was a complete circle, and I just thought to raise that it really helps to invest in biodiversity data, because you do get, it pays good dividends to a development bank when they have to assess themselves later.
Yeah.
And just to make one quick other point, we had invested in SANBI, which is South Africa. And when we do the water risk filter in South Africa, which is biodiversity rich and variant across the landscapes, it's incredibly valuable because it's fine grain data that we're feeding in and getting out fine grain information. But when you go across to the rest of Africa, where that kind of level of data isn't as prevalent, then it gets less valuable where there isn't so much data. So that's why it's so important for development banks to invest in biodiversity data in countries. Just pick a country and invest in their data.
Yeah. Of course. Yeah. Thanks. That's a very good addition. The power of these tools very much depends on the availability of data, of course. So as you said, it's indeed a very powerful tool, but the basic layers of data need to be there. Of course, that's always a condition. And you can imagine for South Africa itself, this is the case, but for many other parts in the world, this is still, this can improve. And indeed, I know development banks that are contributing to the Global Biodiversity Information System, which is a data platform that tries to combine many sources of biodiversity data. Because as a development bank, you are gaining additional information about biodiversity in many places over the world, and if you can share that with others, that will only improve overall biodiversity performance. Yeah. Thanks for a very useful addition. Any other comments or questions at this moment before we dive into the risk assessment approach? Okay, maybe now on the risks. This is, I think, this is one of the what I personally like very much: risk and opportunity assessment and scenarios and so on. This is also about materiality, materiality of risks, and you see here magnitude of risks and the likelihood of risks, and maybe you can add additional criteria that gives you then a materiality score. I want to present the natural capital valuation tool that we developed on behalf of EBRD a few years ago, and I thought it was a very useful tool because EBRD is, as you know, of course, also a development bank, and they committed to nature positive goals. So together with a number of other development banks, wanted to commit to contribute to nature positive outcomes, and therefore they wanted to have a tool to demonstrate that the investments in certain projects, that they really have an added value in terms of nature. So they wanted to compare the cost of non-action, because very often if you don't invest in a certain region in certain projects, then the situation is getting worse very often in terms of nature. They wanted to compare the cost of non-action with the benefits of action, but therefore they needed a tool. So, and the NCV tool that we developed for them offers corporates, because we think it's also useful for corporates and financial institutions, a landscape level approach for assessing a project's nature-related risks and identifying de-risking measures and investment opportunities that contribute to nature-positive outcomes. So how does it work? It provides quantitative, where possible, monetary information on the state of nature. Monetary information is then related to ecosystem services, where they can be monetized, and because not all ecosystem services can be monetized. So this information on the state of nature and the related risks and opportunities, not only for nature, but also local communities. So there's also a social dimension in the tool, local businesses and investors under different scenarios. We always consider the current scenario, of course, what's the state of nature now, the baseline. And then we think in terms of future scenarios like the business as usual. No investment by the bank, ongoing impact drivers, climate change, and so on. That's the business as usual. And then we have the investment by the bank, which is the project scenario. And then maybe a sustainable project scenario, meaning with a modified project where you already take into account a number of de-risking measures. And that's how we do it. The NCV tool is fully aligned with the SIA. I don't know if you heard about SIA. It's the System for Environmental Economic Accounting. That is, it's from the United Nations. It works with a uniform system for classifying natural capital stocks and flows. It's in fact natural capital accounting, and it's now already in more than 90 countries worldwide, used by national statistical offices. And okay, it's a good methodology to classify nature in asset types and then attributing condition and extent and so on. But it's also aligned with CSRD, TNFD, and also SBTN, because it's very much taking into account carrying capacity of landscapes. Our idea is that, okay, in this picture, you have, imagine a landscape, and the landscape is in a certain condition. Now you can invest in that landscape to improve nature condition in the landscape. You can do that in two ways. You can try to reduce the pressures, and this is often happening. Water treatment installations, solid waste treatment. This is all about pressure reduction. This is following the mitigation hierarchy. This is fine. Pressures need to be reduced on nature. But you can also invest in resilience of ecosystems. So you have, in many parts of the world, degraded ecosystems. You can try to make them more resilient. These are investments in ecosystem restoration, like wetland or mangrove restoration, or room for the river projects, whatever. When you do these, both of them, you get in a situation from maybe very high risk, many nature-related risks, to low risk. And this low risk situation can be considered as a nature positive outcome. And then we try to put our analysis of the current situation in this framework. What will it mean if nothing happens? The business as usual, maybe very often an increase of the pressures, a further degradation of ecosystem quality, while on the contrary, a project can turn this whole thing, depending, of course, on the characteristics. This is the overall approach. Now, this is an example of how it works out in terms of materiality. This was the situation, replacement of old hydropower infrastructure in a river valley. So you had already, was almost a century old, number of dams in the river for energy production, hydropower. And now the infrastructure manager is replacing, they are removing all these old little dams by one bigger dam, more downstream, and with an underground pipeline to bring the water to the bigger dam. But what does it mean for the upstream part of the river where these dams are removed? And here you can use a number of what we call natural capital risk indicators, like water availability, habitat structure, species diversity, but also business-related things like security of energy supply. And here you see a transition risk, like a reputational risk for the company. And this was very much related to landscape integrity. And you see, of course, you can, based on the state of nature indicators that we collect, you can, you have, this is just illustrative. This is the picture at this moment. When you don't take any measures, you can expect that, for instance, species diversity will further decrease, and is becoming very likely because of the increased occurrence of droughts and so on. Climate change is doing a lot of negative things related to nature. But if you invest in the project, then you can you have much better outcomes in a double materiality perspective. So not only for nature, but also for the company, the energy company, because it's much more secure in terms of water provisioning. And you can create heat maps in this way. So what in a certain landscape, what are the most prominent, the most important risk areas related to nature, related to natural capital? We do this based on the concept very often of distance to threshold. For instance, for water supply, we try to find information on the current consumption of water in a landscape, and we compare that with the natural regeneration capacity of the landscape. So what is the natural reproduction of water supply in the landscape? Okay, if there is a complete mismatch, so if there is overconsumption of water in a landscape, then of course it's a high risk. And then we can compare with the future scenario. If the water is coming from glaciers, which is often the case in many parts of the world, and we all know that climate change is affecting glaciers, then this risk will become very, very important in the future. So if you have an investment, a project that is relying on water availability, then it's really becoming a very high risk. So this distance to threshold concept is very important in risk assessment related to nature. So we applied this model a number of times for EBRD, and they are now mainstreaming it in terms of their green city action plans all over the world. But there are other ways to assess nature-related risks, of course. Then quickly something on target setting. This is the final part of the LEAP approach. Target setting, here you have also different possibilities. You can stick to the, let's say, the more conservative approach and only say, okay, we try to be compliant to regulation, nothing more. But you can also go to committing to nature positive. Everything what we do in terms of our investments, we try to contribute to nature positive outcomes. So we try to optimize ecosystem restoration or biodiversity benefits in every investment that we do. Or you can also rely on science-based targets network, which is then really quite demanding in terms of coming up with science-informed information on what should be now the real target in terms of nature. So you have a range of possibilities in terms of target setting. You can also have targets on deforestation. I don't have to tell you, many banks have already implemented specific targets related to nature. So always combine different tools in a smart way. There is not one tool covering it all. The thing is that you need to combine several tools to come up with the best outcomes. Yes, this was this exercise. It's still in my presentation. I think we need to decide, Kirsten, how we share this. But you can have a look. It's based on a fictive case. You can see it helps you to check ANCHOR, IBAT, WWF, biodiversity risk filter. Here is this example of the indicators being used in the WWF biodiversity risk filter, and using the scores. I mentioned everything more than 3.4 is used for materiality and so on. Voila, and then quickly going to the pages on the website of TNFD, the TNFD adopters page, where you have an overview of typical facts, frequently asked questions, and where you also have, that's very interesting, I think, for you, an overview of available TNFD reports by companies. You can filter. I did it. I checked it again before this presentation. You can filter on finance, the finance sector, here, the sector, and you immediately have a range of examples for finance sector. I don't think there is one for a development bank yet within the list. I checked, but there are many for commercial banks, for insurers, and so on. And this is an example. You see a commercial bank, Bank of Australia, focusing very much on real estate. And you see here, this is a little bit of a combination of Anchor and other sources. So for the typical dependencies and impacts where in their value chain the major impacts are occurring. You see from very high, medium, and so on. So this is the type of outcome that you can get. Voila, and that's the end of the presentation. We still have a few minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johan, for the great presentation, sharing your insights and also your experience with the tools. Yeah, if there are any questions, please, we still have 5 minutes left.
I've got a very quick one.
Yep.
I want to say it was a brilliant presentation in every way. I think that tool, that heat map tool, I mean, we would love it. Is it possible for EADB to share it or not? Through you or how?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can. We are allowed by EBRD to further apply this tool for any company that is interested.
Put us down. We're so interested. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to all the participants. I think it was a very important session today. And if you think it's important, we can repeat it and make the same presentation in 2026 for the next training program, because I think to hear and to work on LEAP approach or TNFD process and approaches are complex and very useful for everybody. So we can speak about it later to know if it's demand and need from our members. But thank you very much, Johan, for such a presentation, because it's a very important issue for us and a big need and demand from our members. I don't know, Christine or Johan, if you want to add something.
No, also only from my side, thank you very much. And I see a lot of thank yous also in the chat and some applause. So yeah, thank you, Johan. And also thanks to everyone for your contributions and sharing your experience.
Thank you. It was a pleasure for me. Now I need to jump to the next presentation.
Yes, thank you very much, Johan.
Okay, all the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.